in Corinthians, it states this: for God is not the author of confusion. And if this is not the most confusing book that has ever been written, you have to show me another one. But how do you parse those two? Because even for a biblical scholar, it takes so much time to go back and forth. And even I'm sure you'll acknowledge there's some contradiction in there. There's stuff that you're like, I just reject that. There's a lot of like fuzziness within this doctrine of what is supposed to be from a divine being. How do you parse those two things? A very confusing document versus I am not the author of confusion.
The short answer is that Paul was wrong. Because when you look in there, there's no real way to make a rational case that the Bible is univocal, that it never contradicts itself. Like, you've got to go through all kinds of mental gymnastics to make that just possible, not even to make it probable, just to make it seem possible. You've got to twist yourself into a cognitive pretzel. And I think the what's going on here is that what the Bible says is not really a statement of the way it is. It's an argument. It's just saying, hey, let's think about it this way. And the way we go about reading the Bible today is the same. It's just, I'm just going to throw this argument against the wall. Let's see what sticks. And it usually comes down to consensus, whether groups of people agree with you or not. And this is why we have a bunch of different denominations and a bunch of different theological perspectives. I just responded to a video earlier today, Tucker Carlson and John Rich talking about how pre-trib rapture is a lie and it's caused a bunch of damage, and post-trib is the way to go. And pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib, under-trib, over-trib, I don't know. These are just different arguments that people are putting forth because it helps them make the text more meaningful and more useful to them. It's just part of that negotiation. And so I would say that if you're negotiating with the text, just be aware that you're doing that. I think if people are open about this is a way that we can make sense of the text. It may not be what the author intended, but this makes the text meaningful and useful for us. If you can do that openly, and you're not, like I said previously, trying to structure power in favor of already privileged and powerful groups, if you're not harming people, if you're not increasing instability and things like that, more power to you. But the notion that the Bible is inspired and inerrant and univocal is another one of those arguments. And it's an argument that is not supported by any data. It's just a dogma that a person chooses to accept. And that's as deep as it goes. You either choose to accept it or you do not, because the data are not going to come to your rescue with an argument like that.
I think that's fascinating, come from a theological background too. I haven't seen many scholars that are as open of saying, like, Paul was wrong. Like, if I would have said that in my school, they'd have thrown me out on the streets. Oh. And I think it's refreshing to realize that 2,000 years later or 1,900 years later, that you can look at that time period and be like, well, things are drastically different and things do take place in different societies. And if Paul was writing about what we're experiencing in America, what would he say? I don't think a lot of those same things would be repeated.
Yeah. And in fact, this is a part of the discussion that I don't bring up very often, but people talk about, well, what would Paul say about today? Well, that's a question of counterfactual history that has a lot of different ways we can go into it. Like, are we just plucking Paul out of the first century and dropping him in today? Because first we got to get over him shrieking about what just happened and the fact that the world didn't end 2,000 years ago, because all of Paul's writings are written based on the notion that the world is about to end. Jesus is coming back. Don't even have kids. It's no use because Jesus is coming back too quickly.
Before 2,000 years later, will pass away.
Yeah, 2,000 years later, if we're like, hey, Paul, guess what? You were kind of wrong about that. He's got to get over that before we can ask him any other questions. And then we got to teach him English and all that kind of stuff. And so
check out this iPhone.
Yeah. So there's so many details and nuances to those counterfactual history questions that people just don't consider. But they want to be able to transfer things wholesale from the Bible to today. They want to be able to say, look, Leviticus says it's an abomination for a man to sleep with another man. That's the conclusion. Who cares about why they were saying that or what precisely they were saying? We just want to take that conclusion and drop it into today, even though human sexuality is understood entirely differently today, even though we know much better than ever the implications of different kinds of sexual relationships. It's just so complex, and nobody cares about that because they're just trying to leverage those texts to serve their structuring of power and values and boundaries to advance their own identity politics. And all the authors of the Bible were doing the same thing. And trust me, if the people who have heard me say Paul was wrong about all kinds of different things had the authority to be able to throw me out on the street, they would have done it a